Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode of Celestia on Air Deciphering STEM, the podcast of Set Celestia, the Astronomy, Astrophysics and Space Tech Club of Pixxel. We are your hosts. I am Yashi and
I am Abdul. Today with us we have Awais Ahmed. He is the founder and CEO of Pixxel, a space technology company currently aiming to build a constellation of Earth imaging satellites to provide constant daily coverage of geographies around the world. Awais is a BITS Pilani alumnus, and he was a significant member of the BITS Pilani Cubesat team, Anand. He has also worked and interned in many aerospace companies like HAL. We are glad to have you here, Awais.
Glad to be here, guys. Thank you.
All right, so without any further ado, let's just jump into the questions. We have some questions here that our viewers and everyone requested and curated. So, the first question is why did you want to establish a startup in an unconventional sector, especially in India, where till now only one organization presided over the entire space industry?
So I think it was not that I wanted to create a startup in space. It was that what I was doing and what I loved sort of led to the creation of a startup. So it all started with wanting to work in the space sector, essentially. I was part of the Hyperloop team, and when I was there, they took us on a tour of the SpaceX factory, and we saw the rocket engines being built, we saw the rockets being built, and that's when I decided that this is a sector, this is the field that I would want to be in. And after coming back from there, just read up as much as I could about space, read up, what are the advances that are happening in space technology, and where there's an opportunity, what I could do in the field. Working in NASA and SpaceX was not an option because they only hire US nationals or citizens. And in India, as you said, it was just ISRO that was an organization where you could work at. Looked at different opportunities, and we found an opportunity that we could build our own satellites and beam down a higher quality of data set. And it eventually started as another student team where we had a bunch of students together working on building this, raising sponsorship and launching it. But during the course of the time when we were working on it, we realized that there's a lot of long-term potential to what we were doing, and to raise money and everything else, it made sense for us to do it as a startup rather than as a student team. So that's how it came to be. It's just that I think in the most simplest sense, I loved space, and this is a field I wanted to be in, and there was an opportunity to sort of contribute to the sector. And the best way to do that was as a company or a startup. So that's how it led to the creation of Pixxel, and not that we wanted to create a startup in space as such.
Oh, I see. That's a really interesting story. So, like, what were some of the challenges you faced, while establishing this as a startup?
So I think the challenges were we were still students. We were in the final year at BITS when we were doing this, right? So building a satellite requires significant amounts of capital. It's not something that you can just build in a lab or build a prototype of. You want to build a prototype requires significant amounts of capital. So raising money was, I think, one of the challenges that we faced, especially as students. Firstly, in India, people investing in hardware startups is rare, and then when you add space hardware to that, the risk factor goes a notch higher. And then you add a couple of college students doing it, and then people don't really want to take a bet. But that's where I think college alumnus came into the spotlight, and they helped. And we were able to raise amount of money to start building the satellite. From then on, we haven't looked back. So I think the biggest challenge would have been to, where do we get the money to build the tech? The other was, even though we had a bit of experience working on hardware, be it at Hyperloop, but be it at Team Anand, the experience that comes from building a satellite is something that can only come from building a satellite. So to be able to get advisors and consultant people who had worked on satellites from ISRO, it took some time for us to be able to put that together, as well as to be able to get more people on board who had worked on space hardware. So it is a combination of young folks who wanted to shake things up and combination of experience that knows what works and what didn't. And I think, yeah, those were the couple of challenges that we faced. To be able to find where to manufacture it, who do we partner with. But yeah, nothing that was insurmountable, but I think these would be the critical ones.
Right. Speaking of Anand, like that was the CubeSat project of BITS Pilani. So let's start off by talking about what a CubeSat project is, because a lot of campuses do have a CubeSat project of their own. But what makes a CubeSat project so special?
So I think with Team Anand, it was the team that was working with the Indian Space Research Organization. CubeSats, it's a very standardized way of making satellites. And when you standardize the making of satellites, you standardize the components that go into it, which means that you have a lot more options to procure your components from, which means that these components can also be made in bulk, which reduces the price as well. So the cost of launching something to space came down from tens or hundreds of millions of dollars when NASA or any other space organization launched it to a few tens of lakhs of rupees that you could do it from. Now again, the applications depended on what you wanted to do it, but it provided a way for anyone anywhere with enough sort of capital and backing to launch something into space, which is a fascination for a lot of people. And at Anand, it was a bit more of a serious project where the Indian Space Research Organization had a student satellite program where if you were a college and you were building a CubeSat and you went to them and you worked with them, they would launch your satellite on their rocket for free as a ride share. So that was the thing that Anand was doing. It was BITS Pilani's official student nano satellite team that was collaborating with ISRO. It was a team that was doing the crux of the work, but there were people from ISRO that were guiding. They used to review. It needed to go through a very rigorous process. And BITS Pilani as a university was sort of backing the project as well. So that was my first and second year at campus, where it translated from just a love for space to actually working on some hardware that had the potential to go to space. So that was the Team Anand experience. I joined it at first in the winter holidays, the first winter holidays after joining WITS. So it started in the second semester and worked there for about a year. And that was the first brush in my life in terms of working on something that required a very rigorous analysis, that required multiple different disciplines to work together and to even collaborate with an organization like ISRO who reviewed it, and it went through a very stringent review process. So that taught a lot. I think that would be the experience at Team Anand.
That's amazing. But there's also the fact that every CubeSat project, even though it's still a standardized satellite project, it's still unique in every sense. Can you talk about what Project Anand was about specifically? What did it want to achieve?
Yeah, most of the things with CubeSat, as I mentioned, was standardized, right? You have like 1U essentially is one cube of 10 cross 10 cross 10 centimeters. 3U is stacking 3 of those cubes. 6U is stacking 6 of those cubes. Now, which means that you have very limited space, etc., to sort of work with, which means a lot of things are standardized. If you leave, say, in the 3U, 2 units of that could be covered with your electronics and everything else that needs to support the main payload. And the remaining one, you could either have a camera, it could have a communication antenna, it could have anything else for that matter. So that way it was not very unique, but the thing that Anand was sort of trying to go for was having a camera on the imager and to be able to use that to take images from space and analyze that for use cases specifically in ocean health monitoring, coastal monitoring, agriculture, forestry, and the sort. So that was what specifically we were looking at in Anand. But the focus was on learning as many things as we could from scratch in terms of what goes into building a satellite. It was not just we needed to put something together, band something together, and send it up as soon as possible. It was that the people that were working on it also needed to learn what goes into building the spacecraft. What is the rigorous process and analysis that you need to do, that for anything that goes into space. And I think that was a very significant experience that led to everything else that came after for me as well. So, what we were doing specifically at Anand was, it was a CubeSat with a camera that would go up, take images, and then we would use those images.
So,
So in a lot of ways, Project Anand was a great influence on Pixxel, in your vision of Pixxel.
It was a critical factor in shaping the skills that I needed for Pixxel, but a student team is very different from what it takes to run a startup. That had to come while running the startup itself. But what Anand gave me was, it taught the skills that needed to go into a project that involved satellite building, and gave that exposure in terms of working with the scientists at ISRO as well. So it provided the skills and the procedure to be able to do something like this. But running a startup has been quite different from being a part of the student team. The timelines are different, the priorities are different, the speed at which you move are also very different.
So Anant was basically a photo imaging satellite, right? And your first project, your first major project at Pixxel is also a series of photo imaging satellites. So, what made you decide that your first project would be that, like a constellation of photo imaging satellites?
So I think it came as a result of what the opportunity and the gap was in the sector. As I mentioned, after coming back from SpaceX HQ, just read up as much as I could about space, and saw what the gaps were, what the cutting edge was. And while reading up, we decided we would participate in a competition called the IBM Watson AI X Prize. Now, here is where you need to use some sort of artificial intelligence technologies to create positive impact for the world. And for us, that was to be able to use AI and satellite imagery together. We were looking at tackling problems like illegal mining. We were looking at tackling problems like air pollution monitoring and water pollution monitoring. We were looking at pest infestation detection, crop diseases in agriculture, and the sort. So that was what we started with. And while working with different sets of images that existing satellites beamed down, we realized that almost all of these satellites, they couldn't even see certain problems. For example, in agriculture, if we wanted to know what the crop health was, we could do that. But if you wanted to know what the soil health parameters were, what nutrients were lacking, whether a particular crop was under irrigated or over irrigated, what the chlorophyll content and the moisture content in the leaves was, that was something that could not be done. So we needed something that could provide a lot more granularity to what you were doing, which is where the opportunity and the gap arised. And what we did then, when we realized that the existing data is really not good enough for certain use cases at least, and we reached out to companies, organizations who were using satellite imagery in one form or the other. We asked them whether if you were able to provide them with a data set of such and such specifications, which was better than existing data, would they pay for it? Would they buy it? Would it be a significant step up to the use cases that they were currently having? And that sort of concretized our thesis that yes, there is a possibility for beaming down a much more superior data set, for which we need to build a much more superior camera and then build a superior satellite surrounding that camera. That was what led to us saying that, okay, this is what the idea for Pixxel is going to be. It's not that we started with wanting to deploy a constellation of satellites. It's that while working on this, we realized that there's a gap and an opportunity here, because especially when you're starting a startup, just your intent and love is not enough. You need to also know whether it's something that people will pay for, whether there's an opportunity or a gap for something, and then how do you go and capture that. So all that sort of converged together. The love for space that I had, the opportunity and the gap there, and that experience that I had with Anand and Hyperloop India, which said, okay, we'll take a step back. We will solve the more fundamental issue here, which is the beaming down of high quality, high throughput data from space. These images, which will be used for applications in agri, oil and gas, forestry, climate change, any other sector for that matter. And that is when the vision was concretized for Pixxel, and we started manufacturing the satellite.
That's amazing. So I think one of we were already fascinated by when you're talking about monitoring crop health and soil changes from that big of a height. So can you talk about what kind of data they ask for? So you talked about that the data set wasn't available back then. But how do they use the data to monitor the soil changes? What kind of data are you actually measuring in terms of technical aspects? Are those spectroscopy data, or some other kind of data?
The imager itself is in stealth right now. We're not revealing the very specs of what we've,
Okay.
but it's images and data that will enable us to do a lot more than what is currently being done. And we will reveal what exactly the specifications of the data are and what use cases it will come with once we launch the first satellite, which should be February this coming year.
So we're looking forward to that.
Fascinating.
We're looking forward to the launch of your satellites. Talking about your satellites, how long did you take to, like design those satellites and finalize those designs, and like what tools did you use in designing them, and how do you plan to, once all of them are launched, to make them work and then integrate them with AI? So did those other factors like AI integration and everything, did that cause you to like make some changes in your design, upgrade it later, and all that?
So in terms of how long it took to build the satellite, we started the designing of the satellite and everything in February of 2019, and by July 2019 we sort of had an idea that this is how the satellite will look like, which is when the manufacturing sort of started in August, September. And it took 6 to 7 more months from then to have all the components manufactured. After which we have been putting the satellite together, we have been integrating it, we have been taking it apart and then testing individual components and then putting them back together and testing the satellite as a whole. So the entire process from having the starting the design to having something launch ready would be about 12 months, but we are striving to bring that down even further in the years. But for now, I think the designing plus manufacturing to having it launch ready is about a 12-month period, where the manufacturing itself is about 6 to 7 months. And that said, in terms of what we used for the building the satellite, it's like building any other hardware. I mean, if you're using electronics, you'll use the same softwares that anyone else in some other electronic companies or projects will use. If you're building something on the structures and thermal side, it's the same SolidWorks and SimCenter and other softwares that are being used by mechanical and thermal engineers that are used. So the tools don't really change in terms of the exact subsystems and components that go into it. It's just that you need to be much more rigorous in your analysis because it has to work in space in conditions that are quite stringent, quite frigid, quite extreme. So we need to test them also here on ground. So that's essentially the philosophy in terms of working on the satellite. We also need to make sure that in case a particular component fails up there, since we can't replace the other ones are sort of redundant, so that they can take up the work of the one that has failed. For example, we have essentially two onboard computers, so two chips that are two microcontrollers that are handling the day-to-day operations of the satellite autonomously. In case one of those fails, then the other board has the capacity to take up entirely. So it's split between those two initially, but in case any one of them stops working, they take up uh, the work. Or if you're looking at different sensors, we always add a couple of extra sensors. So in case one or two fail, the rest of the sensors can still take up the work and continue running the operations there autonomously. In terms of AI, there's a couple of areas where you can use it for the satellites itself. One is on the data or the images after it's come back down, which is the easier aspect. It's using computer vision or deep learning algorithms to take images and extract insights or information from them. The other is to be able to have AI onboard the satellite itself. Now, here is where we're taking sort of a very Tesla type approach, where the satellites have the hardware necessary to run AI based tech up there, but we won't be starting off with a very heavy work to begin with. What we will have is the capability to transmit software up to the satellites once it's up there, and the hardware will be able to take that. Some things we could do is, instead of analyzing, say if you want to identify the number of ships in a harbor, so instead of beaming down an entire image, which is very bulky, and then counting those ships down here, we can have an AI that's running up there itself that can count the number of ships in a harbor and just beam down that number. That way, the amount of information you have beamed down reduces significantly, and you can image more. Or if you need to identify what the cloud cover is going to be, there could be an AI model that's running continuously to sort of identify and predict whether this area is going to have cloud cover, whether it is worth imaging here or not, and then take the images, so as to then not take images and then realize that this is an image that has a lot of cloud cover, which means that it's actually not useful for analysis at all, and we can discard that right up in space instead of beaming down that image and wasting bandwidth and wasting space. So those are the bit of things that we are looking at. In the very long run, we will also be looking at swarm intelligence to have a very intelligent constellation such that they can move in and out of phase with each other in terms of increasing frequency over certain geographies at a particular time or date if you need it, or things like that. But as of now, it's still in the very early stages. Given that it's space, keeping things simple works best. But as and when we launch the constellation, we will have one or two of those satellites for pure experimentation up there, where we will keep uploading different software upgrades from ground to keep checking how things will work there. And then once we have demonstrated that, then they will be rolled out en masse to the rest of the satellites.
Okay, those are some really, really amazing goals you have. Like that is something which it's like it's tough of science fiction to say the least. And it's really amazing to hear you talk about technology like that and that it would be possible in the coming future. So, for your
Yes.
satellites, are you using like off-the-shelf components, or are you designing all of them on your own, or it's a mixture of?
It's a mixture of both. We are not as simplistic as a CubeSat or a nano satellite. It's quite bigger than that, because, as I said, we needed to first know what the quality of data needed to look like, and then design a camera that could make sure that that quality was achieved. And then the satellite was built around the camera to optimize the operations of that camera, rather than saying that we will take a 3U size or a 6U size and try to cram as best a camera into that. When you do the latter, you have limited physical and volume constraints, and the physics of your optics and the physics of your cameras are constrained with that, which we didn't want. In terms of our camera and sort of how we went about it, it was that we first looked at what the quality of it needed to be, and then build the camera and then build a satellite, which meant not all of it could be off the shelf. It was not as easy as just procuring a CubeSat body from somewhere, a camera from somewhere else, putting it together and sending it up there. And since we designed the camera ourselves for our mission, and then the satellite is designed around it, certain components like the sensors, like certain actuators, like the GPS, we procure off the shelf. There's no point in reinventing that, because that's already been done, and you can get it for quite relatively inexpensive prices. But there are certain things like the camera itself that we can't procure off the shelf. Those need to be designed according to our specifications. They need to be manufactured integrated, and then integrated with the satellite. And that goes for certain things like the onboard computer, the software that we're building, or things like that. And in some cases, we specifically design certain boards and we give it to companies and subcontractors that will manufacture those boards specifically for us, and then give it to us. So it's a combination of wherever we can use off the shelf, we use that, but not everywhere we can do that, which is where we design our own things. So striking that balance is important, because it also means how fast we can work. So that's how we are going about it.
That's amazing. So, okay, we actually floated a form and a lot of questions poured in regarding this podcast. One of them was about the question of privacy. Now, that might be a kind of silly question to ask, but what do you think about it? With the advent of many imaging satellites capturing the surface of the Earth, what do you think about the privacy issue that some people might consider is a big part of it?
The privacy issue comes in when you're doing very, very high resolution satellites, for which you need 300 kg, 500 kg, 700 kg satellites, which we are not doing. What we are looking at is very large scale applications, specifically, non-defense based commercial applications in agriculture, in oil and gas. We are trying to look at fields. We are trying to look at, oil and gas pipelines. We are trying to look at forests. Our images won't be able to capture individual cars or individual car plates or even identify individual people. That's something that very, very large satellites will only be able to do. So in terms of the privacy, and that sort of translates from the policies that different countries have. They say anything above 30 centimeters in the US or anything above 50 centimeters in the US is something you can freely use and distribute without any security concerns or privacy concerns, because that data cannot be used to identify individual or cars or something like that. Yes, it can be used to identify the number of cars in a parking lot, but that only gives you an aggregate and says that this was the business that was done for this mall or for this thing. So, I mean, and any technology for that matter can always be used for something bad. But in terms of the destructive potential that the imagery that we have in terms of privacy, we are nowhere close to the resolution that's needed from a height of 500 kilometers to identify individuals or be of concern to privacy or identify and map certain individual homes. We, in fact, wanted to make sure of this. We engaged the legal team to sort of look at the quality of data and where we stand on that. And there were no concerns on the privacy front. The data that we have didn't qualify for anything that the government classifies as security concerns or privacy concerns.
Yeah, so
That's pretty
that's a
much what we have.
concern. Yeah. So, going forward, do you have any plans regarding going to other celestial bodies like the moon or Mars using your satellites, exploring them using your satellites?
I mean, yeah, I've been fairly vocal about this previously as well, right? The thing that bands our team together is twofold. One is to bring down the benefits of space down to earth and try to make things here more sustainable, be it by increasing agricultural produce or be it by reducing the emissions that natural gas pipelines make or industries make or factories make. The other is to expand outwards towards space, build on the capability that we have in space technology to, an example is we have been talking to folks to see if our satellite can be piggybacked on someone else's mission, where we would deploy it around the moon and to see where water is, what minerals are available, what the soil content or the land content there is, which we can do with the same kind of imager that we have here, which would enable people to sort of help identify where there are ice caps, where there's water, where would be the ideal place for settlements when it eventually comes to that, or send it to Mars and do the same. But in the very long run, we also want to be able to deploy these satellites towards the asteroid belt, map out the asteroids, map out which of these actually have water for fuel, which of these have which minerals, map them out, and build sort of like a map there. So eventually, when we're in a position to leverage the resources of the solar system rather than on Earth itself, which would help free up Earth from a lot of heavy industry, we are able to provide that data and eventually maybe bring back the materials ourselves for manufacturing in orbit here or around the moon. So the plans definitely are there, but for now we are focusing on this constellation because as long as we have our basics right and we have the capability to take any space hardware from design to launch ready hardware, we'll be able to do that for the rest of the things as well. That's something that our team has done. We have, in our team right now, we have people from Team Indus as well who have experience building a lunar rover that was one of the winners for the Google Lunar X Prize. So they have experience building, rovers, and they have experience building a whole host of space hardware, and we'll continue to build on that. But I think not in the next 4 years. After that, yes, we will look at a lot of interplanetary mission. The goal and the vision is to bring down the cost of access to the solar system. Instead of building large orbiters which cost hundreds of millions of dollars and take years to make, you can build and launch these small satellites in a few months. You can launch them for very few amount relatively, and then you can send it to any planetary body, be it Saturn, be it Uranus, any of the moons of these gas giants as well, which means that then that data could be used to identify hotspots or say that this is something that's weird, we need to go and identify this more, which means that the future missions could be focused on only those bodies, instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars in the first place to go and realize that okay, we should have probably sent it to another planetary body. So those are the plans that we have, but as I said, all in due time.
We wish you all the best for
Yes.
those plans.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Yes. So let's kind of come to not the last question, but let's kind of come to an end with the. Do you have any advice for the upcoming space tech enthusiasts? You were once. I'm guessing you're still a space tech enthusiast. What do you think is a right starting step for people interested in, endeavors such as you have taken yourselves?
I think it's in the end, it's about your love for space and how curious you are and how passionate you are to sort of do it. Ever since I was a kid, I forced my dad to get me encyclopedias to read about space, to buy me telescopes and things like that. So as long as you are continuously learning what's happening and building your knowledge, connecting dots between different things that didn't seem like they were connected, and then realizing that there's an opportunity or a gap here, or this is the work that I love to do, regardless of whether it's a startup or whether it's working for a startup or working for ISRO, NASA, or anyone else for that matter. It's in the end about what you love doing and what you want to do, and to just be curious about learning more and more things. Eventually something will click, and that's in the end what we are at Pixxel. We are all a bunch of space lovers who are trying to send some hardware up to space. We are a bunch of space nerds or space geeks that just want to do this, and that's what helps us to wake up every day and sort of go to work and love what we do. It's not that we need to force anyone to come, which also creates like a really good culture in terms of the work we're doing, but also keeps us grounded. We know that in the long run, as I mentioned, we want to be able to send hardware to the asteroid belt, or even further beyond than that. Maybe even an interstellar mission sometime, if we are able to reach that level of technology. So as long as we are all aligned on that and we are working towards that, it keeps us grounded to say that this is what we need to focus on now, and then we do it later. So it doesn't matter if it's as a startup or if it's as a part of a space agency or if it's part of another company or another startup. Just do what you love. It's as simple as that.
So those were some very wise words from you, and this was a really great and really enlightening experience talking with you. And we thank you for taking out your time and coming to our podcast. It was really, really great having you here.
It was fun for me as well, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining. So this was our episode for today. Join us next time on Celestia on Air Deciphering STEM. Thank you for listening.